We get our first glimpses of Earth in the year 2001 in what we'll call the Floyd section of the film. Our first image is that of an orbiting satellite carrying a nuclear warhead capable of striking presumably any point on the Earth's surface. It is introduced through perhaps the most famous graphic match cut of all time, which poetically compares the humble beginnings of mankind's weaponry to that of modern times. As Arthur C. Clarke mentioned, there's no indication in the film itself that we are in fact looking at a weaponized satellite. The only reason we know this is that the script originally had a narration to accompany the opening of the Floyd section. The narration for these images is as follows. By the year 2001, overpopulation has replaced the problem of starvation, but this was ominously offset by the absolute and utter perfection of the weapon. Hundreds of giant bombs had been placed in perpetual orbit above the Earth. They were capable of incinerating the entire Earth's surface from an altitude of 100 miles. Matters were further complicated by the presence of 27 nations in the nuclear club. There had been no deliberate or accidental use of nuclear weapons since World War II, and some people felt secure in this knowledge. But to others, the situation seemed comparable to an airline with a perfect safety record. It showed admirable care and skill, but no one expected it to last forever. The first weaponized satellite that appears in the script actually belongs to Russia. Keep in mind that this was filmed around the height of the Cold War and tensions were high between Russia and the United States, but more on this a little later. That said, it looks as though this was changed, as this American military aircraft insignia appears on the side of the first satellite. What follows is a German weaponized satellite and, according to the script, a French and a Chinese weaponized satellite. The satellite models were about 2 feet long. What we are seeing are actually still photographs of the models, which were shot on a large horizontal camera. You'll notice that they don't appear to turn three-dimensionally. In an interview, special effects supervisor Douglas Trumbull talks about constructing the models. He said, "Basic construction of models was of wood, fiberglass, plexiglass, steel, brass, and aluminum. Fine detailing was made up of special heat-forming, plastic cladding, flexible metal foils of different textures and thicknesses, and of wire, tubing, and thousands of tiny parts carefully selected from hundreds of plastic models ranging from boxcars and battleships to aircraft and Gemini spacecraft. The camera could get very close to the models with no loss of detail or believability." The concepts behind these designs were meant to be as realistic as possible.
Two of these men, space scientists Fred Ordway and Harry Lange, formerly of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and both active in space vehicle construction, are Stanley Kubrick's principal astronautic advisors.
We've been brought in here by Stanley Kubrick to more or less ensure the scientific integrity of the film, to make sure that it's very, very close in reality to what we're doing today in the spaceflight program. And naturally, we're looking forward 35 years, but still we want to make certain that it has a base of reality.
These and many other satellite models that didn't make it into the final cut were designed by Harry Lange. They were each roughly 2 to 3 feet long, and most often cylindrical, with solar panels and various antennae for different missions. Throughout the shooting, meticulous care was taken to keep track of the minute details concerning the camera movement, speed, shutter speed, and exposure. Thousands of rolls of Polaroid film were used to check the basic exposure and lighting setups. They were filed for reference. In addition, every single separate element was wedge tested for exposure, running the gamut from several stops overexposed to no exposure at all, in increments of 1/4 of a stop. At the end of each take, each element would be re-wedged. Every take of every element that went before the cameras was meticulously wedged and checked against previous and subsequent wedges to ascertain that the lighting conditions, color, temperatures, etc. remained absolutely constant throughout. If you'd like to know more about wedge testing, click this button to open a new window. The light used to create the sun in these shots had to be 11 stops overexposed.
One of our problems on the movie was the Earth. And one of the illustrators on the movie was really struggling to paint the Earth. This is actually a flat painting. He found this technique of painting on glass. He would paint white paint on glass and then scrape it away with a razor blade and get these kind of naturalistic looking cloudy effects, which were very successful.
The glass painting of Earth was then lit from behind and photographed on an animation stand.
The hardest guess was, how would our globe, our Earth, look like from space, because nobody had ever seen it until only a few years later. And he was so glad that he didn't get that wrong. It was a little bit light. It should have been a bit darker maybe, but he was very pleased that the guess was okay.
Because Kubrick did not want any of the production materials from 2001 winding up being reused for other films, he ordered all of the props, models, and costumes destroyed after filming concluded. Sadly, this beautiful model of the space station ended up in a local dump, where it was allegedly smashed by kids.
So the space station ended up in a dump. This was about 10 years ago, and it was found, and the poor photographer who grabbed these pictures didn't have the presence of mind to grab the damn thing and put it in his trunk.
This sequence is cut to the music so beautifully and gracefully that the orbiting and turning of the technology and Earth comes across as sort of a ballet.
Music played a big part of the editing process because, of course, the visual effects sequences, no dialogue. How do you judge the pacing of the scene? How do you judge how long the visual effects should necessarily be? Where Stanley would be sitting at a moviola here, I would be here doing the bench work, as it were, feeding him the film. He would be looking at it, selecting, marking, being run through a moviola, pencil marks back to me to cut, paste on with a joiner or join with a joiner, build it up through the spools. Very much the way that you see this equipment now. And there was a tremendous romance attached to it, obviously, which can never be supplied by a computer.
However, the opening to the Floyd section almost sounded like this. A soundtrack was composed by Alex North, who did the score for one of Kubrick's previous films, Spartacus. As the legend goes, Kubrick would edit the films using guide pieces, and had North compose a score to sound similar to the Blue Danube and other classical pieces he was editing to. In the end, Kubrick didn't like the score that was written, and with the premiere fast approaching, he went with the guide pieces for the final film. This was unorthodox in that it was pretty much the opposite of what the score for science fiction films normally sounded like at the time, and these famous classical pieces were already well known. North was not notified and found out that his score wasn't used when he attended the premiere. Needless to say, he was upset. The story of how Kubrick came to choose the Blue Danube in the first place is quite interesting as well.
Every day we'd watch the rushes of the 5 different special effects units that had been filming 24 hours, 7 days a week. And there was a production chap called Colin Brewer, I remember, and he used to fall asleep in the rushes, which was fine, except that he snored rather loudly. These were usually around for about an hour at lunchtime, and Stanley had a thing called a rock and roll gizmo, which allowed him to go backwards and forwards on the special effects shots, and these were all mute. So it was understandable that Colin would kind of nod off. But it was a little bit embarrassing, and the projection, on the way out, the projectionist pulled me over and he said, listen, I've got some old sort of music for pleasure records, you know, how about maybe I should put some of these on, it might help keep everyone awake. So I asked Stanley, and he said, yeah, it was fine by him. And a couple of days later, we're watching the space station shot, and it just happened to be the Blue Danube. And when the lights came up at the end, I remember Stanley turning around to us and said, do you think, would it be a stroke of genius to use that?
Close to the time of 2001's release, Kubrick explained, "Don't underestimate the charm of the Blue Danube," played by Herbert von Karajan. Most people under 35 can think of it in an objective way, as a beautiful composition. Older people somehow associate it with a Palm Court orchestra, or have another unfortunate association, and generally, therefore, criticize its use in the film. It is hard to find anything much better than the Blue Danube for depicting the grace and beauty in turning. It also gets as far away as you can get from the cliché of space music.
But the Blue Danube happened actually quite it was an accident. He originally had other music in mind, and then he felt that it was just too conventional. And he also loved the idea of showing everything turning. You know, the spaceship is turning, the aeroplane is turning, the globe is turning, everything is turning. Now, you know, it invites the walls. And yeah, he loved it. And everybody at the moment said, oh, I mean, this is crazy, you know, how can you be an old Viennese waltz for space? Well, I think by now it's been proven right.
Now, one can't possibly hear Strauss's Blue Danube without thinking about space. Funny, isn't it? Considering that the Blue Danube was composed almost exactly 100 years before 2001: A Space Odyssey was in production. The Floyd section of the film was shot between December 1965 and January 1966. The Blue Danube was composed in 1866. Kubrick explains his reasoning further in a separate interview with Michel Ciment. However good our best film composers may be, they are not a Beethoven, a Mozart, or a Brahms. Why use music which is less good, when there's such a multitude of great orchestral music available from the past and from our own time? When you're editing a film, it is very helpful to be able to try out different pieces of music to see how they work with the scene. This is not at all an uncommon practice. Well, with a little more care and thought, these temporary music tracks can become the final score. This shot of the Orion was also a still image of the nearly 3-foot model. The floating pen effect is one of the most creative and ingenious of the film. It was done by simply sticking the pen to the surface of an 8-foot diameter sheet of glass that was then rotated. For this shot further away, the pen was just hanging from thin monofilament nylon strands. For the closer shots with the pen stuck to the glass, they moved or floated one end of the set away to make room for the camera. Here's the effect being recreated by the original actress, Heather Downham.
When Stanley Kubrick was auditioning for Space Hostesses, I think he saw about 300 or 400 people. I think every agent in London was asked to send the people they thought were the right ones. But at that stage, I almost didn't go because I had terrible, terrible toothache. And I was sort of quite high on painkillers. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just go along, you see. And I think I was terribly blasé. And when Stanley Kubrick asked me a question about anything, I really couldn't be bothered to answer. You know, I just sort of said, oh, yeah, I'm sure, like that, you see. And I think he thought I was really quite an oddity and totally mad. And then he said, do the spacewalk. And of course, by that stage, what I would have found hard to do was walking straight. But since I'd had all these painkillers, I did a sort of wobble down the room. You know, sort of bit of a lurch and a wobble down the room, and apparently that's just what he wanted. So I was totally surprised about a week later to be told that I'd actually got the part. Every morning before we started filming, 3 space hostesses had to meet in Stanley Kubrick's caravan, and we would sit there solemnly, and by this time we were dressed in our white trouser suits and with a plastic bag over the top because he was terrified of us getting dusty. And the first assistant would say to us, Mr. Kubrick would like your thoughts for the day. So come out with anything, like, I now see immortality is the fate of us all. And the first assistant would relay that to Stanley Kubrick. And he'd sit and think for a little while, and then he'd say, good, we can go with that. Let's start work.
In an interview for American Cinematographer, Douglas Trumbull explains the television in front of Floyd. Kubrick wanted shots of a futuristic car and close-ups of a love scene taking place inside. A crew was dispatched to Detroit to shoot a sleek car of the future which was provided by, I believe, the Ford Motor Company. The exteriors were shot in 35mm, but the interiors were shot without seats or passengers, as 4x5 Ektachrome transparencies. Using these as background plates for a normal rear projection setup, an actor and actress were seated in dummy seats, and Kubrick directed their love scene in England. Shot on 35mm, this was cut together with the previous exterior shots and projected onto the TV screen using a first surface mirror. This was projected onto the television screen from in front of the seat in front of Floyd. This shot was particularly complicated. The Earth was shot from a 6-inch color transparency on an animation stand, moving at 0.0025 of an inch per frame. The stars were shot separately to match, then matted to clear all the elements in the shot. The space station model is 6 feet long. Orion was photographed from a still picture tail view, camera tracking away. Its movement was timed and planned to gain slightly on the previously filmed space station movement, a matter of trying a few different speeds until one looked right. It was checked in a theater by using 2 projectors, one projecting the original shot of the space station, the other the takes of the Orion. With black backgrounds, this was possible to do without flooding out the screen. For the shots from inside the cockpit of Orion, the center screen is a computer-driven display that simulates in real time the approach to the space station docking area, much as the late 60s astronauts visually docked their LM with Apollo command module by means of radial grid and vertical horizontal coordinates. The readout was an actual film simulation of a docking approach. It included guidance corrections. It was made by an animation, not by computer graphics. The other 2 readouts are supposed to show a routine cascade of status displays for the other systems in Orion. They would be displayed, some believe, largely to reassure the pilot that conditions are normal. Douglas Trumbull explains, to produce the thousands of feet of continually changing graphic readouts that covered the multitude of screens in 2001 would have been an impossibly long job using ordinary animation techniques. We terminated work with the local animation camera service, set up our own 35mm Mitchell camera with stop-motion motor, and with the help of a very talented and artistically oriented cameraman, we began the job of pasting up and juggling around artwork under the camera as we were shooting. In this way, sometimes as much as 1,000 feet of active, colorful diagram animation could be produced in one day. Specific readouts showing docking alignments taking place, testing procedures underway, and other specific story points were not as fast and easy to shoot, however, and the job of producing all of the readouts for 2001 took nearly a year. The first lines spoken, at 25 minutes and 44 seconds into the film, were spoken by actress Maggie London. She was considered to play the passport girl, but her American accent was apparently not authentic enough, and she was instead assigned to deliver the first lines of the film. In an interview, she recounts her experience working on the film. She says what should have been a few days' work turned into 3 or 4 weeks. Stanley had 3 sets going at the same time. We would be made up, ready to shoot at 8 a.m. in the early morning, and our director would have inspiration for something on another set, so we were left waiting for his return for a couple of days or maybe a week. These days turned out to be fun for me because I spent time getting to know the actors Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood, the astronauts in the lead roles, and William Sylvester, whose scene I was in. And as for her impression of Kubrick, I never saw any signs of tension on the set. He was soft-spoken and very pleasant. I just remember seeing him lost in thought with the perfection of his project obviously on his mind. The part of the passport girl went to Sheila Cannon after 3 months of auditions. In an interview, she said, Kubrick was also concerned about the sound of the actresses. I mean their pronunciation. My accent must have suited him better than the others. If Alan Cummings' experience with Kubrick on Eyes Wide Shut is any indication, Kubrick apparently liked having actors use their natural accent as opposed to putting one on.
He was very nice, and I went, hey Stanley, you know, it's nice to meet you finally, I'm Alan. And he was all like, you're not American. And I was like, I know, I'm Scottish. And he went, well, you're American on the tape. And I went, yeah, that's because I'm an actor, Stanley.
It is likely that Cannon had an advantage with a natural American accent in a movie produced in England. For some reason, Sheila Cannon and Maggie London, as well as some of the other small roles, did not receive screen credit for the film. It is still unclear as to why this happened, but Cannon believes that this was just something that slipped by while they were making the credits. Hardy Amies, who designed the iconic costumes, was on the set during the filming of this scene. Amies was actually a fashion designer, and not only that, at the time, he was Queen Elizabeth II's official wardrobe designer. Amies and Kubrick apparently had a similar perfectionist mentality, which caused them to clash to the point of requiring an intermediary. Cannon recalls Amies being present and involved during all the auditioning process as well, which required the candidates to walk for Amies with the costumes on. In a profile on Stanley Kubrick by physics professor Jeremy Bernstein, Bernstein writes about visiting the set in 1966. He writes, tacked to a bulletin board were some costume drawings showing men dressed in odd-looking, almost Edwardian business suits. Kubrick said that the drawings were supposed to be of the business suit of the future, and had been submitted by one of the innumerable designers who had been asked to furnish ideas on what men's clothes would look like in 35 years. The problem is to find something that looks different, and that might reflect new developments in fabrics, but isn't so far out as to be distracting, Kubrick said. Certainly buttons will be gone. Even now there are fabrics that stick shut by themselves. And look, not a single button.
Hardy Amies' inspirations for 2001: A Space Odyssey came from watching the old 1930s Flash Gordon serials, those very futuristic costumes that were designed for that series, and then movies like Blow Up. He was fascinated in the beatnik look of the 1960s, and he said leather was the new lace, and he had very strong opinions on fashion, materials, and new things that were going on within the industry. So the beatnik look was certainly inspiration. Baseball, I mean, he spoke to Freddie Fox about those space helmets for the stewardesses, and baseball helmets were an inspiration for Freddie's designs. He looked at models like Peggy Moffat and her work with William Claxton, and then Twiggy, Twiggy, her look was also an inspiration. So he was looking at the 60s and what was happening at that period.
All the garments were made to be subtly futuristic without being too noticeable. Even the less subtle pieces were made to be practical. The famous egg-like hats worn by the stewardesses were designed by Frederick Fox, and were meant to be padded to prevent head injuries from bumping into the ceiling during zero-gravity flights.
I was never allowed to touch mine. The moment it was made, it was wrapped up in cellophane or plastic or whatever, so no dirty finger marks could be on it. The wardrobe lady was terrified of him, because when we had these white helmets to put on, she'd say, don't touch it, because if Stanley sees your fingers on it, he'll go mad. So it came wrapped up in plastic and then was put on my head. And they were the most wonderful shape, because I think they suited everybody. They were very glamorous.
There was practical thought behind every piece of wardrobe, every prop, and every set. Kubrick even decided what time zone would be used on the space station. Kubrick chose Eastern Standard for the convenience of communicating with Washington. Kubrick makes brilliant use of the set, giving us spatial awareness through this shot, which not only pans to establish the entire set, but gives us a more distant angle on a location we will visit shortly for the conversation with the Russian scientists. We also get up close with a functional detail of the space station, the videophone room, which gives legitimacy to what is seen in the backgrounds of later shots, and serves as a way to break up the establishing shot and the conversation scene, giving what is essentially one set a variety of spatial imagery. The interior of the space station was a giant curved set over 300 feet long and sloping up at one end to nearly 40 feet. It may be noticeable that in a long shot of two men approaching the camera from the far end, their pace is slightly awkward, and this was due to the very steep slope at the end of the set. Most action took place in the more comfortable area at the bottom. The Earth image seen through the window of the space station was a rear-projected 4x5 transparency and a special rotating mount. The set was curved as part of the space station's wheel that would simulate gravity through its rotation. The little girl playing Floyd's daughter is in fact Kubrick's daughter, Vivian, who would later go on to document her father's productions, and even wrote the iconic score for Full Metal Jacket. In this scene, Floyd's daughter asks for a Bush baby for her birthday. They filmed a scene in a department store set showing the Bush baby being bought that was cut from the film before its release. The artwork of the Earth, seen through the window here, was done by John Rose. Sections were chosen with a variety of glass cloud overlays. Transparencies needed careful exposure to make the Earth look like a bright object. The Earth on a rotating still transparency projector is seen on the large screen in the space station window area. The picture phone was designed with the help of John R. Pierce of Bell Laboratories, who designed the Telstar communication satellite. This is just one of the many companies that contributed to the film.
We've heard you've been getting assistance from industries throughout America.
Well, we most certainly have. We've been working with many companies, about 50 really. IBM, General Electric in Philadelphia, RCA in Michigan, Bosch and Lomb in Rochester, New York, and so on down the list. Wherever we need help, we've gone to industry, and they've been more than delighted to give it to us.
Aside from the questions 2001 raises, it was also meant to be a presentation of futurism. The idea was to inform, intrigue, and normalize the idea of technological progress and space travel.
And what we are doing in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, is showing some of the things that will develop in the world of the future as a result of our present first steps into space. You know, the exploration of the universe is much more than a contest between two mid-20th century powers. It's really the next stage in the evolution of mankind. I'm sure that the men who built the first boats out of reeds and logs never imagined the ocean-going commerce of today, or the great nations beyond the sea. And similarly, the men who started the conquest of the air only a lifetime ago couldn't have conceived of the great jets that are now roaring through the skies. Well, what we're starting now with our drive into space is the next step in evolution. Out on the moon and planets are the new frontiers which our age needs so desperately. The next generation will explore the planets, bringing back new knowledge, answering old questions, and of course, asking fresh ones.
The next scene involves a conversation between Floyd and some Russian scientists. We can see the logo for the Russian airline company Aeroflot on a couple of the scientists' bags. This scene depicts a more positive representation of the female gender's place in the space age as opposed to the more stereotypical roles depicted earlier. It is important to note that this was filmed during the height of the Cold War between Russia and the United States, and yet their meeting is rather friendly for the most part. We do get a sense of the United States being somewhat superior as Floyd, the American, has information that these Russian scientists are not privy to. Nevertheless, it opens up the idea that humans of the year 2001 will share in the exploration of space together, regardless of their national affiliation. Keep in mind that this was filmed during the height of the space race as well. Along the same lines, it should also be noted that during this time, the United States had recruited former Nazi scientist Wernher von Braun to aid in NASA's attempts at putting a man on the moon. The film implies that regardless of which country wins the space race of the 1960s, it is mankind itself that is destined to explore the cosmos. Even though it is a simple conversation, this scene is wonderfully shot in what looks like only 4 setups. If we take a really close look, we can see a simple concept at work here. Despite a long shot featuring 5 main subjects, Kubrick knows exactly where you are looking. We can tell because we miss a couple of continuity errors that we would have otherwise noticed had those areas of the screen been the focus of our attention. Notice the way in which Floyd is holding his folder changes, and how the sweater winds up behind the chair rather than draped on it. The blocking centers the shot on Floyd, with the subjects only moving when the attention should be on them. It's almost bizarre how statuesque they are when they're not interacting with Floyd. That is, except for one part where the male scientist makes movements while one of the female scientists is talking. This seems distracting, but it was a brilliant choice because the man is antsy to ask his question about Clavius during the inconsequential chit-chat. And a little later, look at how this female scientist starts moving her head slightly to bring the attention over to her just before she is about to speak. The background of these shots, this one in particular, is fairly light, which causes the subjects to stand out from the background. We can get a better sense of how this works by raising the contrast. You can see how Floyd is framed in the center without any dark spots behind him touching his silhouette. There are also strategically placed red chairs on the right side of the frame, giving depth to the scene. There's a balance to the frame with the subjects on either side of Floyd, and the chairs and windows on one side, with the offices and monitors on the other. And finally, there are several lines of sight that lead the attention to Floyd. There's a similar thing happening in the next shot: contrast, balance, line of sight. And again, contrast, balance, line of sight. Thanks for watching. You can find the sources in the description. And if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button now because there are plenty more videos on the way for cinephiles like you. Thanks again for watching.